All right, welcome everyone. It is noon, so we'll go ahead and get started here. People may continue to sign on, and that is completely fine. Thank you for joining our Better Behavior Together series. I'm Christy Gagne, a program manager with Telehealth Rocks. Just a little bit more about Telehealth Rocks. We are a federally funded program that focuses on school behavioral health, and we do this by working on social determinants, supporting school-based services, and telemetry training just like this one. So just a few notes for you before we get started here. This session is being recorded and we will send it to you afterwards. Your microphones have been muted, but you are welcome to unmute to ask questions or type in the chat. Certificates of attendance will be emailed after this series is over. So just make sure it's very helpful for us to track attendance if you either change your Zoom screen name to your first and last name or type your first and last name in the chat so we can make sure that we track you all. All right, that is it for me. I will hand it off to Melissa to get us started.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Christy. And thank you for everything you do and the entire Telehealth Rocks team does to make these opportunities possible. So hello, everyone. Happy Thursday. Happy end of August. Or wow, end of October. I was about to say, doesn't it feel like the end of October? And instead I said August. So happy end of October. So glad that you could be here today. For those of you all I haven't had the pleasure to meet yet, my name is Melissa Maris. I'm a clinical community psychologist based in Columbia, Missouri. And I have been working with the Telehealth Rocks team for about the last 4-ish years. And so thrilled to be here today to talk again about better behavior and really thinking about functional approaches within a trauma responsive frame. I am joined by my colleague, Alexis. And so Alexis, do you want to unmute and say howdy to everyone?
Yes. Hello. I hope everyone is having a great end of October. Do you want me to go ahead and introduce and give background since we did the last time?
That would be great.
Okay. All right. So hi, I'm Alexis McMillan. I live in Southeast Kansas. My background is in community mental health as a master's level clinical psychologist. And then I moved into being a school psychologist and then working on social emotional learning and behavioral health planning for the Coffeyville School District. And now have kind of leaped back to community mental health. But I am very passionate about merging mental health and education together to do what's best for kids.
Fantastic. Thanks, Alexis. So just a couple of pieces, additional kind of housekeeping to point out before we move into our didactic. If we go to the next slide, Christy. So first, project disclosures, we don't have any. And in terms of mitigating potential bias, we are always aiming to present the very best of what we know from science and research to you all. In a lot of these areas, this work is evolving fairly rapidly. And so we are always looking to the research to guide what we are talking about and the suggestions that we make. If at any point you would like to learn more about what we're looking to or kind of how we came to different conclusions, please feel free to reach out. This is the kind of content that we love to dork out on and would love to talk to you further about that. Also, if you ever have anything that you're looking at that you think is helpful, that would be great to share with other folks. This is a great venue to do that. And so if you send us resources, we will send them on to friends that we talk to in the future. Go to the next slide. So after the session, as Christy mentioned, we will send the slides and the recording, and certificates of attendance will be sent out. Please, if you have any questions, comments, feedback, resources, this email address that was just posted in the chat is the best way to get a hold of us. Shoot them an email, shoot us an email there, and then we will respond and try to get questions answered. Okay, so in terms of today in our agenda, we are going to talk a little bit, so brief didactic, kind of some content, some tips to share, and then we'll be walking through a case scenario. So I'll be presenting this case scenarios based on an actual child, actual struggles with school. And then we're actually going to break out into a couple of small groups to have more discussion about the case and also what this work looks like in your school or your organization. And then we'll come back together to synthesize and identify key points and say goodbye. So with that, just another kind of thing to notice. on these, on each slide, you'll see these scroll looking shapes. And with that, we've tried to pull out kind of some practical applications and tips with the hopes that this content can be very immediately actionable. And so make sure you look for that. Also, we will be posting chats throughout the presentation today. So these are different links, sometimes links to the content on the slide, sometimes additional resources. All of this will be included when we send out the presentation afterwards. So don't feel like you have to hurry and copy and paste from the chat, but just some additional resources to take a look at. Fantastic. So as we get started with some content today, just a reminder that last week we talked quite a bit about anxiety and anxiety within a school mental health perspective, what happens with anxiety, how we can respond, and really focusing on this functional approach to thinking about anxiety and how to manage that. We had a friend who shared a case about a young person who was struggling in their school and did some collective brainstorming around that, and we'll do very much the same today. But last week talked a little bit about how we all have brains, right? And that idea of brain-based behavior, brain-based thinking being really valuable. So you'll see the video of the hand up in the corner, and we've talked about this. You may be familiar with that model. But I think the next step of that is, in addition to all of us having a brain, we're also all human. And I think that there is often a risk, especially when we're really focusing on a functional approach to behavior, for it to start to feel a little bit robotic. To be completely transparent, a lot of behaviorism came directly from humans interacting with animals, as in dogs and rats. And so there's a lot of behaviorism specifically that starts to sound kind of robotic. And so I think this is a good reminder just that we are all humans. And so we're always humaning with other humans. And therefore, empathy is a really big part of the work that we do. And this is really the place where I think the trauma responsive framework or perspective is a nice complement to behavioral approaches, functional thinking, because it does kind of ensure that human component comes in. And just like we can teach, and I would argue should be teaching everyone about our brains and how our brains work, and making sure that that's part of sort of our everyday conversation in schools, I think the same is true with empathy. Empathy can be taught, it can be learned. And oftentimes I find that empathy is one of the important tools for us to use to shift our perspectives and also to unlock some different tools. And so kind of this idea of what these components of empathy are, and sort of this fundamental tenet of a trauma responsive, trauma informed perspective is what's on this little Post-it note, that young people are not giving us a hard time. They are having a hard time. So they're having a hard time, and we are in close proximity, which is not to say that it's not difficult. It's not to minimize our own feelings of frustration or sadness or disbelief. All of our feelings are valid. But just this idea that as humans, naturally, we take behavior and we take it personally. We think that it's directed towards us, and oftentimes it's not. So kind of shifting that perspective to really make sure that we're treating humans as humans, that we're remembering we're human as well. We go to the next slide. So when it comes to perspective, I thought I would share this. So this came out a couple days ago in Ed Week. And it was an interesting read for me. I'd encourage you all to check it out. There's some additional charts on that article. But essentially, Ed Week went in and looked at and asked for educator perspectives and student perspectives. And it looks like the headings on this got a little bit wonky, but the dark blue is actually the educator perspectives and the lighter blue is students. So they said, what are the major issues affecting young people's mental health? What is impacting young people's mental health? And so over there in the dark blue, you can see the ranked order of what educators said. So their number one most endorsed item was bullying online by text and social media. So that is, at least for this specific study, that's what educators were saying. That is, 70% of them said that is the biggest thing impacting young people's mental health. And then you can see kind of the list that goes down of kind of the other concerns that came up. Now, when we look at the light blue, then we can see what the students said. So same time period, getting student feedback around what is affecting their mental health from their perspective. And we start to see that it's a little bit of a different list, right? So right off the bat, you'll notice that the lines for the students are shorter than the lines for educators, meaning that 70% are endorsing, 70% of educators are endorsing that top concern, whereas 34% of students are endorsing that top concern. So just in general, this suggests that at least in this sample, young people are endorsing fewer things that are affecting their mental health. And in fact, if you go down to that 9th little short blue line, you'll see that 16% said nothing has had an negative impact on my mental health. And only about 3% of educators said something similar. So if we look at this as a comparison, the number one thing for students in terms of what's impacting their mental health, they say stress related to finishing schoolwork or homework. That's number 10 for educators. And we'll see that the top concern identified by educators doesn't even make the top 10 of the concerns identified by students. It's actually number 15. And so showing a difference here in terms of what educators are perceiving is impacting young people's mental health, and that what young people are saying themselves. And so definitely would encourage you to check out the article. This is one sample at one point in time. For me, kind of the list and even the specifics perhaps aren't as interesting or aren't as important as just noting that there are different perspectives. And again, that when we think about behavior in schools, when we think about young people's behavior and kind of what we're prioritizing, really making sure that we're centering young people and hearing from them about what is impacting them the most. So of course, talking and listening to students so we can get that perspective, and also looking to the humans and data with an open mind and an open heart. And this is hard to do. When we collect information so that we can actually make these kinds of prioritized lists, it's different than when we collect information to prove that what we thought all along was right. And it's a really natural thing to look for some of those biases and to look for the information that's going to confirm it. This is certainly not the only time that there has been a difference in perspectives between educators and students. We see consistent research when we ask parents and guardians about youth and then ask youth themselves that there are different perspectives, and that's great. Different perspectives, it's all information that we can take and use as inputs as we're making priorities in our actions within a school mental health system.
And Melissa, there is a comment in the chat that says, I would be curious if students don't recognize the effects of things like online bullying because that's just become the norm for them.
Yeah, that's a great comment. And honestly, I don't know the answer to that. It is interesting, especially when we think about the generational divides here, right? Of young people who have grown up with this, and those of us, I got my first phone at 21 years old. It's a junior in college. So different world, right? In terms of kind of where things are now. But so I think that could absolutely be possible in terms of the norm. And certainly there's other research out there that's showing young people identifying online bullying, social media as a large pressure. Perspective here is also helpful in terms of what seems hard in the moment versus what are people around you looking at and seeing is an issue. So I think all really, really great points. And I don't know the answer at all in terms of what that all means. But it is interesting. There's a lot of times that I am sitting in groups at tables, et cetera, on Zoom calls with a whole lot of grownups talking about young people and things that are challenges. And oftentimes there are not young people there. And so kind of just thinking about, this is what we're thinking, what might they be thinking, and how might it be the same or different in that importance. And I see a comment here of really listening to and centering youth voice in these conversations. So thank you for that comment. Okay, so in terms of perspective and functional thinking, if we go to the next slide, Christy. So when we talk about functional thinking and really consider how this might be a tool or something that's useful, I always try to remind myself that behavior is communication. Just like if I open my mouth and say, I need help with, and then say something, often behavior is communicating the same thing, just not in the same way. So behavior tells us something. And when we think from a functional perspective, or thinking about functions of behavior, you can see the 4 functions of behavior down in the little trains. So escape, access to tangibles, sensory, and attention. So the idea that if we look at a behavior and we really try to define it, and then look at what's happening right before and what's happening right after, that it can really help us clarify kind of what's going on. And again, one of the most important pieces about using a functional approach is defining that behavior as specifically as possible. And so we talked last week about the idea that what we're aiming for is to describe a behavior in enough detail that someone else could act it out without actually seeing the behavior. And so in that level of detail, so very, very specific. And so having a specific problem and then thinking about this from a problem solving perspective and coming up with different strategies. And again, this is where I think kind of combining that systematic way of thinking about behavior plus really prioritizing empathy and kind of that entire frame really helps us. I find that the empathy component or the empathy approach really helps start the conversation and then also keeps us in it. So it's really hard to talk about behavior in isolation from actual humans. And so kind of getting people to the conversation, empathy and that kind of approach can really help keeping them in it. That kind of empathic language can also help there. And if you are, at a school or you are a person who hasn't done a lot of this kind of functional conversation, one strategy that I've found that has been helpful is to actually practice this idea of antecedent behavior consequence, that functional behavior approach with behavior that is not problematic or undesirable. So, coming up with ways to look at behaviors that are common, that are desirable, and coming up with it then in terms of where's the antecedent, where's the consequence, and really practicing that through before shifting to focusing on problematic behaviors or behaviors that you're trying to reduce, to kind of practice that approach to thinking in terms of functions of behavior. Okay. So in terms of the sorts of behaviors that we're going to be focusing on today, we really wanted to talk about kind of more of the typical externalizing kinds of behaviors. So aggression, disruption, things like eloping from the classroom or perhaps the school. When I talk about aggression, I mean verbal and physical aggression. So things that typically are coming out in more obvious ways. Last time we talked about anxiety, which is typically thought of as an internalizing behavior. So something that is often more hidden. And I think when we sort of consider how to think about and approach aggression, this is hard, right? So right now I am thinking of the behaviors that are oftentimes the most challenging behaviors for teachers, administrators, and others to address within the school context, and that are often talked about when we think about sort of behavioral approaches. So how do we help this young person stay in their seat? How do we help them pay attention? How do we help them stay in the classroom? And here again, kind of from a trauma responsive lens, I think it's important that we try to assume that people are doing the best they can. So teachers, students, ourselves, other people, parents, and guardians. Rarely does behavior change result from telling someone to try harder. Oftentimes in these situations, I would say all the time, people are doing the best they can. Asking them to try harder is likely not going to result in them changing their behaviors. And so it's going to be more frustrating in terms of getting to the outcome we want to achieve. And that just from a very empathic, realistic perspective, oftentimes in schools, adults are very much looking at the short term of how do we make this behavior stop? Maybe it is impacting the learning environment. Maybe it's impacting other students. Maybe it's scary. And so oftentimes we are looking at these behaviors and we become very short-term thinkers. How do we get this to stop so I can kind of continue with my day as proceeded, and kind of move in that direction? And so sometimes we want young people to be quiet. We want them to do what the other kids in the class are doing. And so with this slide, I'm not suggesting that that is not the end game, but I think sometimes when we focus just on that behavior, we kind of lose sight of the forest for the trees. And sometimes that gets us into a little bit of a sticky situation. So oftentimes when I am having conversations with teachers, administrators, other folks in schools about some of these challenging or disruptive behaviors, I end up having some conversations with folks about how to prioritize. So, we have all of these behaviors happening. Where do we start? And so this is another nice triangle. We love our triangles around kind of where you should start or where we should start. And so looking at this triangle, this is one approach to kind of getting started. I am a big advocate for wherever you start is exactly where you were supposed to get started, kind of from a very practical perspective. And so this triangle is kind of showing what should be the top priority, the next priority, or the second priority, or the third priority. And so really looking at those, the highest priority being the behaviors that may be dangerous, aggressive, that are, presenting safety concerns, and kind of further down the triangle. I like this as a frame to look at different behaviors when you're in a position to look at and prioritize which behaviors you're going to focus on. I think that the reality is that often we are in a position where we don't have that choice of what to prioritize, either because we're dealing with one of these first priority kinds of behaviors in the moment, or because someone else has made the decision of what we're going to prioritize. So I just want to acknowledge that before we kind of move forward. Looking at this from a broader sort of public health approach definitely requires the opportunity to kind of zoom out and look at a whole bunch of behaviors at the same time. And that's often just not where we're positioned. And so if you are kind of thinking about how to prioritize student behaviors, but you're often in those situations where you're really talking mostly about individual student behaviors, there are some natural opportunities to kind of what I call think in triangles. So kind of focusing on the individual, but what about everybody else in the classroom? What about everybody else in the school? And so this top scroll is really focusing on that. So there are natural opportunities to take things from the individual to the group. Right now, or recently, kind of coming up on first quarter, which oftentimes is a milestone where schools are looking at things in a different way, looking at whole class performance, looking at how a grade level is doing, a natural opportunity to say, okay, here is an individual, and zoom out, here's the whole group. Looking at any kind of screening or testing that you're doing. So certainly mental health or behavioral health screening, but also any kind of testing that you're doing. So any kind of, academic sort of progress monitoring, any data that are being collected to look at, that's going to push to look at a whole group versus an individual student. Parent-teacher conferences are another great time, and really class anything. So a class trip, a class party, again, that's going to lead us to sort of focusing on that whole classroom. The other kind of strategy that I've used in the past that seems to have been effective is, so I'm talking about an individual student and what could happen in that classroom, maybe to change or to support behavior change. And so that is the issue at hand, but then my response might actually be to focus on strategies that can benefit the entire classroom. And so that way, the challenge, the priority is an individual, but then my response is going to be focusing more on the classroom-wide sorts of approaches. And again, the priority is subjective. Priority depends on who you are and how you're positioned in the conversation. And so I think a lot of times we forget about what a student's priority might be. I think it's really important that we prioritize what the teacher is saying is the most concerning issue, kind of whatever it is that brought them to our attention in the first place, kind of how can we acknowledge that behavior. The example here is, oftentimes there might be what we would call a first priority behavior. So maybe a dangerous or at least aggressive behavior, but the behavior that the teacher really wants to focus on is closer to the bottom of this triangle. And that is just really irritating, and it irritates them day in, day out. And they just need that behavior to reduce so that then they can start focusing on the other behaviors. And I think that's okay. I think that, again, we're human, and that having that conversation and figuring out how to prioritize different approaches really is subjective. Okay. So
Melissa, just to
yes.
chime in, there's another comment in the chat that I wanted to make sure we saw from Juan. This is my 4th year as a social worker in the school setting. I'm seeing more and more of the big conflict between attending to social emotional needs and compliance. The tendency to push for compliance is by default.
Yeah, thank you so much for that comment there. And Chrissy, thanks for bringing it to our attention. Yes, I think I am guessing that probably resonates with a lot of people on the call today in terms of individual needs and social emotional needs and compliance. And I think that this is about the time of year that we would also start to see the rubber meet the road in terms of office discipline referrals that have now started that threshold where several minors are becoming a major. We're starting to talk about maybe brief out of school suspensions. We're starting to kind of meet that line where up until now it's maybe seemed like an accumulation of small incidents, and then from that compliance kind of perspective that we're starting to look at those data sort of adding up. And there's tension here, right? There's tension between compliance and individual needs. I think kind of an argument is that from a compliance perspective, part of it is that for an entire classroom to be successful, the entire classroom has to be adhering to some general behavioral expectations, right? Which I think calls for more of a compliance approach, so rules follow them, versus here is this individual student who has unique needs that make this different. And that tension is always there. Also, we know that compliance tends to emerge as folks get tired, as folks get busy, that compliance is there and oftentimes becomes sort of that reliant piece. And so I love your comment here. And Alexis, you had a comment as well?
Sure. I was just gonna kind of reiterate the statement that I have begun to witness the struggle to accept or be open-minded to the fact that when kids know better, they do better, and that we have a significant amount of lagging skills that get in the way of just doing school, period.
I love that. I love that in so many ways, Alexis, and it reminds me of even kind of what a reminder of what's here, and kind of this idea of how do we take what is going on with an individual and then reframe it to sort of what could support the entire classroom, and how oftentimes what becomes part of the suggestion for a teacher is making sure that the behavioral expectations are understood, they're taught, they're practiced, and that oftentimes when we think of someone being not in compliance, that maybe they don't actually know what to do, which is a different thing, right? That's a different perspective, and again, that's kind of tapping into that empathy that then helps us approach it in a different way. If I've taught it, if I know that a young person knows what to do, I've seen it over and over again, and then we're seeing a different behavior, I'm going to come at it from a different perspective. And so absolutely kind of what do people know how to do? What do young people know how to do? Have they forgotten? And kind of those lagging skills and how that plays a part within that compliance perspective. Absolutely. Thanks you all for these amazing comments. Okay, just another quick piece, talking a little bit about operant conditioning, which is on the next slide. And so for this, and then we're going to talk through this and then talk about this case. But I think that I find this kind of visual for operant conditioning and just really kind of loosely having an understanding of operant condition, again, opens our toolbox in terms of how we might respond or approach. A lot of times when we are doing functional thinking, when we're problem solving around behaviors, a lot of it is kind of it's a little bit of an experiment, right? So once we define the behavior and we really are clear about what behavior we're talking about, it really is kind of this mix and match between, okay, if we change this antecedent, then kind of what is what comes after the behavior, what's the consequence, right? Or if this consequence shifts, then how might that change how we think about the antecedent? And these are just a few different ways to kind of approach that from an operant conditioning theoretical stance. And so this idea of positive reinforcement, positive punishment, negative reinforcement, this might be bringing back, Psych 101 days when kind of learning about the language. I'm not sure that the actual language, so is it negative punishment or negative reinforcement, is really all that helpful. I think what we're looking at is, are we giving something or taking it away? Are we trying to increase a behavior or decrease a behavior? And so different ways to combine that I think helps us think more flexibly about how we approach different behaviors and how we can start to shift either antecedents or consequences to try to change the behavior towards whatever we want it to be. And so just kind of wanted to share that. Key takeaways around kind of yay for functional thinking. In my group, it sounds like a lot of folks are already using this kind of language and this kind of process in their schools. I really think the trauma responsive frame is a nice complement in terms of humans being human. Getting input from multiple perspectives isn't just the right thing to do. It also helps us be more effective with what we are doing, and kind of thinking about the long game. So, how do we put something in place that it absolutely is sustainable for a single young person? But what I didn't bring up, but is becoming an issue, is that other kids in this class with the student we talked about are also now requesting Calm Passes, because they have seen how the Calm Passes are being used. And so there is a question of, what we put in place for one, what is it going to mean for all? I'm not in any way suggesting that we don't individualize interventions and think about that, but that there are times that we can be strategic in terms of putting things in place that all students can access, and that ends up oftentimes being successful in terms of helping the adults support all the kids. So with that, we hope that you all will return for our third and final session here in the next couple weeks. And Chrissy is putting up or is sharing a link in the chat around, if you do want to present a case, we would love that. There's no case too small, and we would love to have a conversation and have some problem solving to support you as well. So please reach out if you do have a case and fill that survey out. We'll reach back to you. We make it as easy as possible. So it really is, I think, pretty simple, and we would love to hear from you. So with that, again, happy October. Thank you for joining us. Good luck with next week and Halloween, and all the fun that brings. And thank you for everything you all do to keep kids safe and to help them succeed. We appreciate you so much. Have a great day.